Okay, so we're going to be continuing with Unit 6 here, this new era of, women's history in the 20th century. So today we're going to be getting into women in World War I and then women through the 1920s, the new woman. So we've seen women be significantly impacted by war in every war leading up to the 20th century. But the world wars are definitely going to usher in a new era in how women can be involved. And we're going to we're seeing ourselves get a lot closer to women being allowed to actually join the armed forces. It's not going to happen until after World War II. But we're certainly on our way. And so we're going to see a much larger role that women can play in terms of military aid and going into some of these war areas and combat zones. Definitely the most common way that women were involved in the war is as a yeoman. Now, when you hear the word yeoman, a lot of you might think of like small farmers in the colonial and antebellum periods. That is a yeoman. But yeomans in World War One, female yeomans, not farmers, totally different. The way that this is marked is yeoman, the word yeoman, and then in parentheses an F. When you see that F, it signals we're talking about women in World War One, and it has nothing to do with farming. These were actually non-commissioned officers in the U.S. military, especially in the Navy. Over 12,000 women are going to sign up to do this. So they were kind of basically, it's like they're enlisted, but they're not, like I said, they're non-commissioned, so they're not technically enlisted. And they would serve all types of jobs. They would do clerical duties, truck drivers, mechanics, telephone operators, translators, and they would have the same responsibilities as men in the military, and they would get the same pay, which is an important distinction there. That's very different from previous wars when we see women get involved. This is also going to mark the first war in which women are allowed to enlist in the armed forces as nurses. They would serve in military hospitals, at home and overseas. Hundreds of women are going to die being nurses in Europe once they got exposed to the Spanish influenza, which, was a huge pandemic plaguing not just the United States, but all over the world. Starting in 1918 to 1920, lasted for 2 years. If you don't know, for the record, Spanish flu didn't start in Spain, has nothing to do with Spain. It started in Kansas. But, neither here nor there. There will be some African American women who will be able to volunteer and enlist as these nurses, but not nearly as many as there were opportunities for white women. The other big role we're going to see a lot of our women doing in the war is being hello girls, or hello girls were telephone operators, switchboard operators. And so they served in a unit called the Signal Corps Female Telephone Operators Unit. You had to be bilingual in both English and French because most American troops were being sent to the front lines in France. So over 450 women were going to be chosen for this. This was a very prestigious job, very important because you have to be able to speak 2 languages, and a lot of these messages are going to be coded. Classified information is going to be sent through these telephone lines. So this is definitely an important job for the war as a whole, and definitely an important moment for women. As far as labor and the war effort at home, we know that large numbers of women are going to be recruited to participate in these wartime jobs. Munitions factories were definitely the largest employer. And we're going to see women not just working in heavy industry, but in also jobs traditionally done by men. So we're going to see more and more women getting into jobs that were seen as definitely more masculine and only jobs for men. Volunteering, work for the war effort that's unpaid, mostly going to be middle and upper class women. We're going to see a group called the Women's Committee of the Council of National Defense, which was a federal committee that organized women to support the war effort, and they would connect with other groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the YMCA, the YWCA, the Red Cross, to raise money and supplies for the war effort as a whole. There were plenty of women who were against the war. We know that Jeanette Rankin, who is the first woman to serve in Congress, voted against going to war in World War I and in World War II. She was a pacifist. But she's not going to be the only one. If you remember Jane Addams of Hull House, she's going to found the Women's Peace Party and lead over 40,000 women in an effort to end the war in Europe and gain peace for the world. She met with President Wilson 6 different times during the war to discuss the conditions of the war, how not only women were being affected, but how families were being affected, in an effort to try and get the war to come to a conclusion. And it'll be one of the reasons why she earns the Nobel Peace Prize. And we'll also see propaganda coming out during World War I, definitely targeting plenty of women and trying to get women to join the war effort. The typical themes that we're going to see in propaganda that are, specifically relating to women are how women and the family are being threatened by the enemy. We're going to see a lot of them using women as sympathetic figures from other countries. If you want to feel bad for Belgium, then they'll depict, a Belgian woman and her sad, poor, or injured child to try to pull at your heartstrings. Also, women were typically used as symbols. We know that the female figure is often used to represent freedom and liberty in America. And we're definitely going to see a lot of traditional gender norms reflected in a lot of this World War I propaganda. Now, as far as women in the 1920s go, this is a period that we call the New Woman. And I'm sure you have heard of the New Woman before. Sometimes we think of flappers when we think of the New Woman, and the flappers are definitely new women, but not all new women necessarily dress like flappers. But there are, every type of woman could fit into this New Woman category. We're definitely going to see new opportunities for Black women in the 1920s. They're going to be playing a new role in urban politics with women like Ida B. Wells, who was a writer and a suffragette during the suffrage period for Black women. She's going to continue her work not only for the civil rights movement, but for women's liberation as time moves forward. Another woman named Ada McKinley, she worked in Chicago. And if you remember, I was talking about immigrants in the previous notes video, and how Jane Addams was trying to help immigrants with Hull House. Well, there was no facility like that to help African Americans in Chicago or in a lot of major cities. And so Ada McKinley founded the Southside Settlement House, which did all the things that Hull House did, but specifically for Black families, when that no institution like that really existed. We're definitely going to be seeing a growing middle class for African American women here in the 1920s, and even the beginnings of an upper class for African American women and women. And the best example we can look to for that is Madam C.J. Walker, and that's her here on the slide, the largest photo here on the left. African Americans definitely have their own standards of beauty in their own culture, and it has a big emphasis on hair. Lots of Black beauticians in the South, even in rural areas, even where there was, you would expect to see a lot of beauty salons and things like that in cities like in Atlanta or Birmingham or Montgomery, Memphis, in southern cities, but not necessarily in rural areas where there's a much lower population. There were not as many of those locations for white women, but there were still plenty for Black women, because even in more poor areas or in rural areas, that standard of beauty was there, and it was definitely considered a crucial part of their culture. So lots of women are going to do this. Madam C.J. Walker's real name was Sarah Breedlove. She was born in Louisiana, one of 6 kids. Her parents and her older siblings had actually been slaves. By the time she was 7, though, she was pretty much an orphan. Her parents had died. She wasn't really connected to all of her siblings. She did move to Mississippi with her older sister, who sort of raised her for a little while. But her brother-in-law, her sister's husband, was abusive. And so in an effort to get out of that family situation, she actually got married at the age of 14. But by 1906, her husband had died, so she moved to Colorado. And when she moved to Colorado, she met this businessman named Charles Walker, and that's sort of where Charles Joseph Walker, and that's where she got the name C.J. Walker from, as her sort of pseudonym was actually his initials. He eventually died, and then they moved to Missouri, where she continued her career. So as far as her career goes, she suffered from dandruff and pattern baldness because of a lot of that was very common for women in general, but especially for Black women in the 1920s and in the 19 teens because of harsh chemicals and a lot of like hair treatment. Hair treatments had these really, and still have a lot of really harsh chemicals in them. Poor diet, lack of indoor plumbing and water, like that can also lead to those issues. So she learned, her brothers were actually barbers, and so she learned a lot of like hair care tips from her brothers. So she started working on translating that for Black women. She started working for another Black woman who owned a hair care line. And she used what she learned there to start her own. And she patented something called the Walker system, which promoted hair growth through scalp conditioning. And her business absolutely exploded and grew to be, really an empire. She employed 20,000 women at her peak, all Black women. And they would do door-to-door selling, sort of like, the old Mary Kay or Avon ladies. They dressed in white shirts and black skirts. Like I said, they went door to door, which was pretty comfortable for a lot of, their door to door sales was not an unusual thing in the 1920s. But as far as, men selling door to door, women are much less likely to let a strange man in their home to sell to them than they are a woman. So a woman being the sales person in that situation is definitely a benefit to the business. She also eventually went international and, had branches of her business in the Caribbean as well. And she used her money. She definitely put it back into the community. She taught other Black women how to run their own businesses and was happy to sort of like pay it forward. Her wealth is estimated at over $10 million, which was extremely high. A lot of people consider her to potentially be, if not definitely the first Black female millionaire, especially self-made in the United States. Probably the first self-made female millionaire in the United States. She owned several cars, a full-time driver. She built several branches of the YMCA in Black neighborhoods of Indianapolis. She's very connected to the Black community. She started a scholarship program for the Tuskegee Institute, which you remember was Booker T. Washington's college. Like I said, she really uses her wealth to help the Black community. She even was a huge member, and she sat on the board of the New York chapter of the NAACP. So she's really going to sort of be one of those women who puts her money where her mouth is and used it to build up other women, especially other underprivileged women. So we're seeing this old wave of feminism fizzle out. That first wave of feminism of the suffrage movement is going away. And we're in this transitional period of like, where does that leave us between our waves of feminism here? What are women really working for? And the birth control movement gaining such traction here definitely is going to shape how feminism progresses. And that's really where that new woman is going to come from. Even Alice Paul, after the passage of the 19th Amendment, begins working on a new amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, which is going to be the second wave of feminism's main focus once we get to the 1960s and 70s. So a lot of times when we talk about this new woman, we're talking about flappers. And so, characteristics of the new woman. Most of them are college educated, especially co-ed colleges are going to become a lot more popular. They smoke and drank publicly. They practice casual sex. They really embrace that consumer culture. They want to buy things. They want to look nice. They value luxury items. Definitely the opposite of old beauty standards. Old beauty standards were about, they would had really long hair that they would typically do in an updo, and the accentuated curves. That was definitely like the beauty standard of that previous like Victorian period, which is why we see the opposite of that in the 1920s. Short bobs, a lot of straight lines in terms of silhouettes, not really accentuating curves, and a lot more makeup. A lot more makeup is going to be popular. Women are going to wear makeup, which in that old standard of beauty, makeup was pretty much reserved for prostitutes. But a lot more women are going to embrace that, and that's really going to be what we see as like the new woman of the 1920s.